This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk and part one of a conversation with David Nasaw. He was Hollywood's savior, a Wall Street buccaneer, a New Deal miracle worker, an ambassador to wartime London. He was also a Hitler appeaser, an anti-Semite, profoundly defeatist, a Nazi sympathizer, and a voracious womanizer. But above all, he was the Patriarch. He's Joseph Kennedy, and he's gotten the biographer he deserves, David Nasaw. David is the Arthur Schlesinger Distinguished Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center and author of the best-selling biographies on Andrew Carnegie, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and The Chief, The Life of William Randolph Hearst, winner of the Bancroft Prize, the J. Anthony Lucas Prize, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Welcome back, David.
Delighted to be here.
David, I have one word for this book. Wow. It is marvelous, and obviously I'm not the only person who thinks so. I opened the New York Times on Sunday, and I look at it and it says the 10 best books of 2012. And I've got the sneaky feeling, since they had you on page one and 2 pages inside, that you might be here. And I open the book, and there it is, The Patriarch, The Remarkable Life and Turbulent Times of Joseph P. Kennedy. It says that you took 2 years to complete the sprawling, arresting account of a banker, cum speculator, cum movie maker, cum ambassador, cum a lot of things. Joe Kennedy was involved in virtually all the history of his time, and his biographer persuasively makes the case that he was the most fascinating member of his large, famous, and very formidable. I'm envious. A lot of people are envious. This is really an astounding book. And wait a second, you get on Jon Stewart, you get great reviews. You're in the Times, great reviews, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and then you do 11 minutes with Jon Stewart. I mean, 2 episodes, 2 time segments. What was it like? It says something about the culture, but go ahead.
Well, he was great. He was great. He sets you right at ease. They tell you when you get in there, and before you get in there, don't be funny.
Right.
Let him be funny. Be yourself. You know, as if a
funny.
historian can't be funny. So I told him some stories, and he started laughing, and I thought, this is it for me. They're going to yank me out of here.
Right.
I'm going to get the hook. But he's got such a great sense of humor, and he reads, and he thinks.
Yeah.
And
he's one of the premier political and social and cultural interviews around.
It's you have a conversation with a smart guy.
Yeah.
It happens rarely.
Right.
But when it happens, it's just
and he's so funny. But he really laughed. I mean, he was really enjoying it. And some of the humor wasn't only verbal, it was sight gags as well. The research in this book, I mean, the only way you can characterize it is Cairo-esque. I mean, this is the researched book. Okay. So, you're sitting at a table with Senator Ted Kennedy and his 2 Portuguese water dogs for a couple of hours. And what? How did you get there, and what happens?
Well, what happens is that through Arthur Schlesinger, my colleague here at the Graduate Center, I met the Kennedy family. At some point, I don't remember when, I said to Gene Kennedy Smith, your father is this really fantastically interesting guy. Fantastically interesting is a morally free term. I didn't know enough about him to say he's a good guy,
right.
He's a bad guy.
You could have said either.
But he's interesting.
Right.
I said, your daughter, Amanda, and Amanda had compiled and published a book of letters from Kennedy to Kennedy, from the children to the father and vice versa. Amanda should write her biography. And Gene nodded, didn't hear anything. About a year later, Gene Kennedy Smith comes up to me at a reception or a party at the Schlesingers, and she says, we, the family, want you to write the biography of our father.
And your immediate reaction is what?
My immediate reaction was, I'm already writing another book, you know. I'm busy.
And this is the chief that you were writing at the time?
I was writing the Carnegie book.
Oh, okay.
So Kennedy's got where they are by not accepting no. You don't say no. So she said, well, when can we talk? I said, 6 months maybe. I'll know where I am. 6 months to the day I get home at night, my wife says there's a strange message on the phone. Anyone who has lived in New York for any period of time and listened to Imus in the morning has heard.
Oh, right, the Kennedy impersonator. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I pick up the phone, and it's the Kennedy impersonator from the Irish show.
Except it isn't.
So I listened to it 2 times, 3 times, and I realized, no, this is the real thing.
Right.
So the senator says, come to Washington, let's talk about you're writing a biography of my father. So I go, we sit, we talk. He's hysterical. He is one of the funniest people, and he's a great, great mimic. He goes through every Irish politician in Boston, you know, and there are lots of them. There's Honey Fitz, his grandfather. God, right. There's Mayor Curley. There's Tip O'Neill.
Oh,
you know,
I mean, these are the giants.
Yeah.
Come on.
And he gets each one of them like dead on. So I'm entertained through the entire time, but I say to him over and over and over again, I'm not your guy. You don't want me to write this book. I'm a crazy historian. I'm a lunatic researcher. I'm going to find stuff that's not going to make the family happy. And who knows, by the time this book comes out, there may be a Kennedy running for office.
Which in fact happens.
Yeah. So he says, no. He says, we want you to do it. We want a real historical account of our father. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. And we figure that if a historian does it, it's going to be a more complete picture.
Particularly if you do it.
Well, he was nice, and he was very complimentary. And I kept saying, no, you don't want me to do it. He said, go ahead. What do you need? I said, I need permission to look at every box that's been hidden away at the Kennedy Library, closed to all researchers.
Whoa,
I want to go through it all. I want to see everything. I want access to the family and to family friends. And I want a commitment in writing that there will be no censorship, no limitation, no restrictions, that anything I find or see I can use in my book, and you will see it when it's in hardcover. He said, fine. It then took 1.5 years to get the final agreement, but it took
and they
a
lived
lot
by
of
the
courage.
agreement.
Absolutely.
Okay, and have they been in, what has been their reaction to this book? Because you really do. I mean, this is an unvarnished portrait of Joseph P. Kennedy. What's their reaction been? You're sitting there. Yeah, that's the reaction.
Well,
silence. See, you did piss them off. You did.
I haven't heard from.
Go ahead.
All I've heard from is Jean Kennedy Smith got in touch with me, and then she wrote a letter to the New York Times complaining about Chris Buckley, who reviewed the book in the New York Times.
Right.
And he's got a sentence in there in which he says that Rose Kennedy
it was brutal.
Priggish,
it was
humorless,
brutal.
this. So Ambassador Smith said to me, you know, I can't let that go. I'm going to write a letter to the Times. I said, go ahead. I said, but listen, I didn't use those adjectives.
No, not at all.
I don't use those adjectives. And I said, you know, you can't hold me responsible for what other people say about my book.
Right.
She said, okay. She said, I'll get back to you when I've read it carefully and we'll talk.
And she sent the letter. I haven't been.
She sent the letter. The letter that was published in the Times. I have not heard from her since then.
Okay. But I mean, really, that's unfair. We'll talk about Rose in a bit. Okay. The subtitle of the book is The Remarkable Life, and there certainly is a remarkable life. But one of the things that interested me, certainly as a quote-unquote student of history and political sciences, the turbulent times. Make the case, briefly, that Joseph P. Kennedy is a Central American figure of his time. Let's say early to mid-20s to 1960. What is it about Kennedy that makes him this giant?
For the historian, and I'm a historian.
Sure.
I'm a historian who writes biographies.
Right.
For the historian, this is a perfect subject because he is a Zelig-type character. But more than that, he not only appears on every page, in every chapter of the history of the 20th century, he's a key player. And he's a key player as an outsider trying to force his way inside. So he's not the establishment guy who's going to give you the company line about the New Deal, about Hollywood, about the stock market, about Wall Street, about banks, about the Cold War, about the new frontier.
About World War II.
About anything.
About
He's
anything.
from the outside looking in and fighting to get his way in. And he is a vantage point. His life is the vantage point from which we can construct an alternate history. We can see how hard it was. You know, we all read the, was Tom Brokaw, the
Greatest Generation.
Yeah. You know, the textbook version of World War II is there were bad guys.
And they were
Nazi
the good
Germans.
guys.
They were the good guys. Franklin Roosevelt said, let's go get the bad guys. The country cheered, clapped, and we went off to fight a war. It didn't happen that way.
Wrong.
It didn't happen that way. 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, the American people do not want to fight a war in Germany.
And you really bring it to life. That's the major part of the book. I guess about 200 or so pages of the book are him in London in World War II. And that history is just fascinating. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, the American people didn't want to fight this war. The American people didn't want to shed the blood of a generation of young men. They didn't want to bring back depression conditions, which they thought would happen if we go fight a war. They didn't want to rescue. They certainly didn't like the Nazis. Nobody liked the Nazis. But nobody thought that supplying the British was going to defeat the Nazis. And when the Soviets entered the war, because Hitler made the worst decision any military leader has ever made.
Except Napoleon made the same mistake, you know.
Well, Napoleon had a better shot at it.
Right, but go ahead.
Than Hitler had. Kennedy, before the Soviets enter the war, thinks the Germans are going to win. Why waste our money? After the Soviets enter the war, he says, well, the Soviets, if we support the Soviets and the British against the Germans, then we're going to have a Soviet-dominated Europe. You know, is that worth fighting a war for? And the answer was no. When you look at his point of view on the war, you begin to understand what Roosevelt was up against. This country,
implacable opposition.
This country did not want to go to war, and this country had neutrality acts on the books that made it virtually impossible. You know, we got to remember, how did we get into World War II? Hitler declares war on us.
Right.
We don't declare war on Hitler.
Right.
So that's just one area. Right?
Okay.
World War II and the lead up to World War II, where if you look at Kennedy, who was the ambassador to Great Britain from 1938 to 1940, you understand a lot more.
You also understand how out of control and in some ways almost out of his mind he was in terms of his views both of himself and the situation there. It seems that he was really out of his league, and I think you've made a comment in other places. It shows you that a businessman shouldn't be a politician or an elected leader. Talk about that.
He was a dreadful, dreadful, dreadful diplomat. And Roosevelt should have known better. But you see, here's something else that we learn about the 20th century. When we look at the totals, Roosevelt wins landslides in 32, 36, 40, 44.
Right.
He wins big elections. So we look back and we say, well, you know, there was never any possibility he was going to lose. Wrong again. Roosevelt was convinced that 1940 was going to be difficult. 1936 was going to be difficult. He needed Kennedy on his side in the New Deal camp. Why? Because Joseph Kennedy was the most popular, most influential Irish American, Irish Catholic in the country. No Democrat wins at
Right.
that period
Right.
without a large Irish Catholic vote.
Yep.
Number one. Number two, Roosevelt was attacked bitterly, mercilessly by the bankers, by the brokers, by the industrialists, by corporate leaders. He needed a banker on his side.
Okay, let's talk about, let me just stop you for a second.
Go on.
Let's step back. How did he make his money? And then let's continue with Roosevelt. How did he make all this money originally?
Yeah.
Now, one of the myths that you destroy in the book, or at least puncture, is the bootlegger myth. How did he make his money?
Okay, he wasn't a bootlegger. We can talk more about that later.
Go ahead.
Wasn't a bootlegger. He makes his money, the old-fashioned American way. He buys and sells stocks with insider information. He learns early how to drive prices up, how to drive prices down, how to manipulate every stock that's out there. He goes to Hollywood, becomes a studio head. At one point, runs 4 different studios at the same time. He demands to be paid in stock options because he knows $1 in salary is $1 in salary.
Right.
But if he gets a stock option for 10,000 shares that he can buy at $2,
Right.
he knows that he can drive that stock up to $10 whenever he's ready to do it, right? And that
Smart
$2
guy.
becomes $10.
Right.
When he leaves Hollywood after 2 years, he has converted his options in such a way that he has made enough money to give each of his 9 children and his wife $1 million trust fund in 1920s money. But he's not finished yet. Because he knows how the market works, he gets his money out before the crash. He knows it's going to fall. The market's going to, he doesn't know exactly when, can't time it, gets his money out in 1928. The market falls, and what does he do? Goes back in. But he goes back in as a short seller. What that means is that he bets that stocks are going to go down. And when Herbert Hoover is telling the American people, don't worry, depression's over, Kennedy knows it's not, and he makes millions and millions more by selling American stocks short.
There's a bear-like element about him, beyond the actuality of a bear market orientation. He is a pessimist.
Yeah.
He's a defeatist, and he's particularly pessimistic after Joe Jr. gets killed in World War II. But the pessimism is there early on.
Like a lot of rich men, he is frightened. He knows how to make money, and once he makes it, he's scared to death that he's going to lose it. And in the Depression, that fear was not, that fear was recognizable, and it was realistic. I don't think we understand today. Again, I'm a historian, and I did this book as a historian. We've been through hard times, but we don't have a clue as to how hard the Depression was for the American people. We just don't get it.
No, only through our parents and our grandparents.
Well,
And we have never lived it.
We've never lived it. 8% employment is tough.
Right,
25%.
I get it.
And so Kennedy is convinced, and he's not the only one again. You look at the Depression through his eyes, and you see this fear that if prosperity doesn't return, the American people are going to go the same way as the hungry German people and Italians and Russians. They're going to listen to a demagogue who says, you're going to have to sacrifice democracy. You're going to have to give me power, but I will get you out of the Depression. And he's convinced that if the Depression continues, capitalism's going down, democracy's going down, America's going down.
What ultimately makes this guy tick over the entire span of his life? What is it up to the time he gets the stroke? What is it?
It's a great question. A great question. I'm not a psychologist.
No, I
I'm a
understand
historian.
that.
But as a historian, I can see this man move with a generation of Americans from ethnic outsider to insider. Again, we don't get it. We don't understand in the 21st century what it meant to be an immigrant Jew,
Italian,
an Irish Catholic,
Sure.
an Italian
Yep.
in the first part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You were defined
Yep.
by your ethnicity and by your religion. And Kennedy, one of the things that made Kennedy apoplectic, he'd take your head off, is if you referred to him as an Irish American. He would say, Irish American? My parents were born here. I've lived here. I've never been in Ireland. I don't want to go to Ireland. You know, I'm an American. I'm as an American as anybody else. How dare you call me an Irish American? Now, he wasn't ashamed of his heritage.
He just didn't want to be defined.
He refused to be defined by it. And I think that battle to get inside Hollywood, inside Wall Street, inside banking, inside Washington, to say I'm as American as anybody else and I'm going to force my way inside, defines the guy.
Yeah, except also he wants to be an insider, but he doesn't want to sacrifice to the team.
Right.
You know, he always wants to hold the position that he believes in, and he holds it to the death, contrary evidence and displeasure of the president and anyone else notwithstanding.
Yeah, he's not a team player. He's convinced that for him to make it, for the Irish Catholic to make it inside, he's got to be smarter than everybody else. So once he gets inside, he's not going to listen to the other guys. He knows what's going on, or he thinks he does. He has this confidence that's frightening. And there's no evidence. He doesn't listen to other people. He doesn't listen to other evidence. He knows best, and that's his downfall.
Okay. You read this book, and it's tragic. It's tragic, certainly in the Greek sense, and maybe in the Shakespearean sense. Is the flaw inside the person, or is it that the gods and the fates conspire against you? Whichever tragedy it is. He survives only what, four of his 9 kids, and he has this debilitating stroke where this savoir-faire, articulate, handsome, well-dressed guy is shriveled in a wheelchair, and all he can say is no. I mean,
You can't make this up.
Did the gods both lift him up and then destroy him?
You know, you can't. If someone had written a fiction book about a patriarch who raises these remarkable set of children, and who lives for them, and finally gets to the point where his son is president, his second son is attorney general, his third son is on the cusp of the Senate career.
Yep.
His daughters are doing well in public service, and suddenly he's struck down by a debilitating stroke that renders him speechless, like his oldest daughter, who's had a miserable, unsuccessful lobotomy. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And then, the only word he can speak, the only word he can utter is no. So he's got to communicate every wish, every want, by screaming no, or by smiling and saying gently no.
Which means yes.
Oh. How many of us could survive having our oldest son and namesake blown up in a bomber crash, incinerated over the channel, when the war is won, after D-Day, a war that the father thinks is unnecessary.
Right.
Then his daughter Kik, who he loves, her husband, she's been married for 3 weeks, her husband is killed in the war. A couple of years later, she dies in a miserable plane crash.
And then
His
that goes
daughter-
a generation later. Go
His
ahead.
daughter, his oldest daughter, who is known at the time as retarded or slow, he gets the best medical advice, which says she'll be able to live with her condition. She won't be angry, she won't be upset if we get her a lobotomy. He agrees to the medical authorities. She has the lobotomy. It's a disaster. She's rendered with the intelligence of a baby. She's destroyed. That's 3 kids. he's lost out of 9. He has his stroke, and Jack is assassinated, and Bobby is assassinated.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. My thanks to friend and colleague David Nasaw for being on the show. Join us next week when we continue our exploration of the life of the Patriarch here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.